I would like to read for you, if I may please, from Matthew chapter 4. If you will kindly turn to it with me and enter into the message that I have entitled, Absolute Truth in Relative Terms. Absolute Truth in Relative Terms. Matthew chapter 4, what is known as the temptation episode. And many of you know, of course, Nikos Kazantzakis, the famous scholar from Crete, supposedly lifted his understanding of the temptation from this. Here was a man who was an enormously brilliant scholar, missed the Nobel Prize for Literature by one vote, and according to him in his studies, arrived at what the temptation episode was all about, and produced that rather ridiculous movie at best entitled The Last Temptation of Christ, which is probably as unbiblical as he could have become. He hadn't the faintest idea of what was going on here in this particular setting. Let me read for you, beginning from verse 1, chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. And Luke adds the little postscript there that the devil left him for a season, and he was going to return again at an appointed time to try it from one different angle. Reinhold Niebuhr, in his book The Nature and Destiny of Man, says there are three kinds of pride: the pride of power, the pride of knowledge, and the pride of virtue. The pride of power, the pride of knowledge, and the pride of virtue. That which seeks autonomy in its absolute sense, power. That which thinks it knows and does not need to be added unto. And that which thinks it is so good that it does not need forgiveness or any imputed righteousness, albeit from a divine personage. The pride of power, the pride of knowledge, and the pride of virtue. And wherever you see the resistance to God, you will find one of these three prides manifested. I think it was Dante who placed pride at the lowest rung of hell, and C.S. Lewis referred to it as the most cancerous of all attributes in the mind of man, because although man likes to treat it as some kind of a simple growth that can be excised, when God describes pride, he describes it in malignant terms. It pervades the whole system. And Niebuhr was right when he identified these three. And what I would like to do, ladies and gentlemen, I don't often do this, but if I have your permission to do it, I would like to read for you 2 or 3 protracted paragraphs from at least 3 different people. One of them is a contemporary, 2 who had written in the past. And I want you to follow that as some introductory comments that lead me to the heart of this text. One of the greatest writers of the 20th century, one of the most scintillating journalists, was G.K. Chesterton. And he said this years ago, it almost seems like it may be written in our time. Listen to what he says. "You are free in our time to say that God does not exist. You are free to say that he does exist, but is evil. You are free to say, like some poor satirist, that he would like to exist if he could. You may talk of God as a mystification or metaphor. You may boil him down with gallons of long words, or boil him to the rags of metaphysics. And it is not merely that nobody punishes you for it, but nobody protests. But if you speak of God as a thing like a tiger, as a reason for changing one's conduct, then the modern world will stop you somehow if it can. We have long passed talking about whether an unbeliever should be punished for being irreverent. It is now thought irreverent to be a believer. Muggeridge says it in much more graphic terms. It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, and vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct. Listen to what Ted Turner says as far as what he sees in the meaning of life. The problem with all the world's religions is that they have commandments engraved in stone, and none speaks about achieving paradise in the 1990s. Christianity had a couple thousand years to try to solve the world's problems, and we're in a bigger mess now than we were ever as we go on killing the planet, destroying our home, and devouring the host. I put a line by Chesterton in here. He said the problem with Christianity is not that it's been tried and found wanting, but that it's been found difficult and left untried. Turner needs to understand that. And we're in a bigger mess now than we ever were as we go on killing the planet, destroying our home, devouring the host. How can Christianity address the problems of air pollution and nuclear proliferation and overpopulation when it's geared towards the issues of Jesus Christ's day, the domination of Rome and grinding slavery? Jesus tried to give his contemporaries hope in the next world because he could see there was no hope in the current one. Why not try what I call 10 voluntary initiatives? These aren't commandments. People of this age shouldn't be told to do anything. And then he goes on to give his 10 voluntary initiatives. I shall skip those. Last paragraph says this: one way to get this going, believe it or not, is TV. You talk about Marshall McLuhan's idea of TV connecting us all in one global village. I believe mass communication has helped make us all closer today than we've ever been. And I believe that the gathering and dissemination of worldwide information to all the peoples of the world is the most important tool we have had for achieving the end of realizing that our planet is the address for paradise. Very, very strong statements. But I wanted you to get into that framework of reference so that we can get right back into it through the message and respond to it. Muggeridge reminded us that all new news is old news happening to new people. All new news is old news happening to new people. And then he went on to say this: if God is dead, somebody is going to have to take his place. It is either megalomania or erotomania, the drive for power or the drive for pleasure, the clenched fist or the phallus, Hitler or Hugh Hefner. Either the philosophy of power or the philosophy of pleasure. I have heard Ted Turner say it, and you may have, that if CNN existed before Hitler, we would not have seen that world war because they would have tracked his meteoric rise and cut it short. If it weren't so pathetic, it would be laughable. The naive credulity that is manifested to believe that somehow we have arrived in a new way. Let's go back to 2,000 years ago when Jesus was in the wilderness and see how he responds to this whole idea of very similar temptations. You see, even though humanism in a sense is new, it was coined during the Renaissance, which was the same time when the word utopia was coined. But after the Renaissance, which you've got in the 14th and 15th centuries, you went into the rationalistic worldview of the 17th and 18th centuries. And they were talking shortly thereafter in the Romantic period of the 19th century. One Romantic writer, Robert Southey, actually said man has been born again. The Bastille had been stormed. Everything was going to be peaceful and millenarian from there on. It was only shortly thereafter that Napoleon came on the scene and destroyed all of the hopes. But while contemporary humanism traces back to the last 3 to 4 centuries, humanism was born in the Garden of Eden when Adam decided to do it his way and set up his own Eden outside of the parameters of God, where man became the measure of all things rather than God. See therefore how this temptation comes to our Lord as Satan comes and challenges him, and the first thing he says to him is an appeal to the intellect. He comes to Jesus and says, why don't you turn these stones into bread? And if you do, the world will follow you, and they will follow you for the food that you're going to feed them. You will somehow touch a need. Now he makes a false assumption here, and so he comes to a false conclusion. The false assumption Satan makes is that the fundamental problem is material, and the false conclusion he comes to is that if you provide that material need, man will really follow you. Have we forgotten in our time that when the Nazi regime came into being, it came through the minds of the most educated people of their time? And the same men who devised the concentration camps sat enthralled before the music of Wagner. The human mind and its capacity to somehow make this assumption that if we educate ourselves, if we feed ourselves, we will all be contented and peaceful one with another. And the resulting philosophy of yielding to that temptation would be the philosophy of materialism, starting with a capital M, a la Marxism, a la existentialism, a la humanism, that which strips the spirit of its essential nature and makes man purely matter. I have been in so many university debates, and I can hardly wait for the professor or somebody to make this comment, because I know it is going to come. Think of all the wars that religions have produced. All the people that in the name of God have been exterminated, all for religious circumstances. And I pause and ask them if they have ever counted the number of people who have been killed in the name of godlessness. Let me give you two examples, and there is a difference. When they have killed in the name of godlessness, they were working with the logical outworking of their own assumptions. Those who in the name of religion have done it illogically, hardly following the very person of Christ, but their own infrastructure that they had set up. So there's at least that comfort, that this was an illogical outworking. With humanism, it becomes a logical outworking. In fact, if you read Charles Darwin, and I looked through some of his earliest notes at Cambridge University, which he used to study, Charles Darwin said the thing that terrified him about his own philosophy is that if it is right, then nature, red in tooth and claw, is only going to expand itself on the basis of destruction. And he even commented on some of the wars that had taken place as actually being good things in the progress of the evolutionary ladder. It was necessary when man was the measure of all things. And it frightened him. Two examples. One of Stalin. Let me tell you where it was all born. One day he was busy eating a meal, and a friend came to him and said, "Mr. Stalin, how can you inflict such pain upon your people? How can you do it? You're murdering them by the thousands." Stalin didn't answer much, and then he said to him, "Bring me a live chicken." And they brought him that live chicken, and Joseph Stalin looked at that chicken, stroked it for a moment, and then started to feather the bird, as the chicken was trying to break away from his grip, wincing in pain as it were. But he clung to it, removed every feather, and denuded its body completely, and then put it down and picked up a few pieces of bread and walked away, and then stood in the distance, and the chicken hobbled over, coming to find some nestling comfort between his trousers to get some warmth. And he put his hand down, and the chicken started to peck away at that food. And Stalin said, "There is your answer. If you want a chicken to follow you for life, you inflict pain on it, it'll follow you for food the rest of its life. People are like that chicken. You inflict pain on them, and they will follow you for food the rest of their lives." It's all right to say man is the measure of all things. Which man? Hitler? Stalin? Hefner? Let me give you another illustration of this, of the materialistic philosophy working itself out. Hitler, who took Nietzsche's philosophy and gave it working power. Just as Alexander the Great took Aristotelian thinking and wanted to spread it across the world, as it were, so we've got Hitler taking Nietzschean thought and using his Superman philosophy to obliterate the weak, one of the weak being Christianity, which had to be in his image, pushed away as a tightrope walker so the stronger man can walk this rope towards Supermandom. I remember preaching in Warsaw, and I'll never forget as long as I live, and my wife was with me. We were driven over to Auschwitz, and I recall seeing an American teenage girl there tear out of a room because she couldn't handle it anymore, as she was terrified that this century has witnessed what it has witnessed. In one room you see denuded children, castrated boys, pictures on the wall. Joseph Mengele carried on his dastardly experiments out there. And in another room you see 14,000 pounds of women's hair stacked up behind glass. As the women were sent into gas ovens and then scalped, the hair was taken, woven into gunny sacks, and sold in the market, as it were. They were obliterating them at the rate of 12,000 every day, as millions were obliterated in the name of a superman, in the name of a super race, the logical outworking of a materialistic philosophy, man merely the measure of all things. Do you know, men like Turner and the other of his ilk would be very wise if they read some of their own gurus of 30 years ago. Take a man like Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, who was a household name in university students at that time, the godfather of existentialism in those days. Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy was what was transmitted to the Angkalea movement in Cambodia, which resulted in the slaughter of well over 1 million people. Sartre was the ideological godfather of the Angkalea movement. He was a hedonistic, pleasure-oriented man. Yet Jean-Paul Sartre himself, on his deathbed, finally said, I have to disavow this which I have believed in atheism. I no longer can agree with the concept that this world doesn't have a designer. And his mistress standing by his bedside said, there you are, he's gone senile. Now, I'm not for a solitary moment implying that the contemporary humanists believe that this is the way it should be. To the contrary, they don't. They despise this kind of violence. But I'm just pointing out that materialism, when it is logically worked out, may legitimately lead to this. See, Jesus said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. He said there's something far greater in the need of man than merely a stomach that is in need of being filled. Here I introduce to you Muggeridge again. He said this. He said he was in India teaching journalism for some years, and he had longed to have an illicit relationship because it had tossed in his mind one of these days he was going to do it, miles away from the one he loved, and so he was going to do it now. So he describes in his first volume of his 2-volume autobiography, the first one is called The Green Stick Chronicles of Wasted Years, quite a massive volume. He says he came out of his room early one morning, it was at sunrise. Nobody was awake in his hostel there. He came out of the building, went into the waters nearby of a river and started to have his swim. And in only Muggeridgean terms, because he's so graphic with the pen, imagination is just stirred as he writes. He says, as he was enjoying his morning swim, he saw a woman in the distance, alone, taking her early morning bath. And Muggeridge said, at this moment, his heart moved in fanciful imagination and thought, this may be the moment. I will give her the money I have. I'm sure it'll be all right. She's a poor woman. I can buy her. And so he started to swim. But he says, in his conscience, there was a raging battle. Don't do it, Malcolm. Don't do it. But something else said, this is the moment. I have longed to cross this line. The stolen waters may be sweeter than I thought. And as he's swimming against the current of his conscience, he swims as hard as he can so that nothing will stop him. And then as he emerges within about 2 to 3 feet away from her in her proximity, this Indian woman, of course, absolutely shocked, looking at this white man swimming towards her in these early morning hours. And then he got the greatest shock of his life as he emerged from the water, looked into her eyeballs, and realized he was staring into the face of a leper. The eroded nostrils, the eroded digitals, all of the features almost looking like that of an animal, blotches of white over this brown skin, and pitifully she just looked at him, wondering what was on his mind. And Muggeridge says, for a moment I wanted to say, what a lecherous woman, until I recognized that I needed to look inside and see what a lecherous heart I have. That's what humanism and materialism resents and does not like admitting. It doesn't recognize that even in good people, even in well-intentioned people, even a man who loves his wife and loves his family needs something stronger within him in order to resist the temptations that the world hurls at him. The Bible makes it so clear. Jesus makes it in a rather sarcastic illustration here. Shortly thereafter, he goes into a home, and as he is there to heal the sick, People are coming in and the press of the people is felt. There's one man who's a paralytic whose 4 friends say they'll never really get to see Jesus this way, so they decide to take the tiles off the roof of the owner of the house. Thankfully, the reactions of the owner of the house are not printed as to what he thought while this was going on. But as the tile is being removed from the roof, these men lower this paralytic. Jesus stuns them and catches them off guard when he looks at this man and says, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." Fellows probably want to say, this has got to be a joke. That's not why we brought him here. What do you mean, thy sins be forgiven thee? This is the classic case of the non-falsifiable. How do you falsify something for which there is no external manifestation? Jesus knows what's going on in these self-styled philosophers' minds. He says, I know what you boys are thinking. You're thinking, wait a minute, this is not why we brought him here. And then he looks at him and says, arise, take up thy bed and walk. And then he looks at the men and says, the reason I have done it the way I have, so that you may know the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins also. Will you wake up, you philosopher, and recognize which need comes first? Spiritual first, material second. You see, it is because the individual heart is the laboratory in which the poison of sin is brewed by each person. Satan moves away from the appeal to the intellect. Now he comes to the will. Here he makes a right starting point. He said the word says that if you jump, he will keep you from dashing your foot against a stone. That's right. So why don't you jump and see if he honors that? He makes a right assumption but still comes to the wrong conclusion. Therefore you're going to do it your way, Jesus, and do it right now. John Polkinghorne at Cambridge is a recent comer to Christianity. He is now a believer and has written some fine books. He's one of the leading quantum physicists in the world. He says that the balance needed in the early seconds of the universe, the early seconds between its expansion and contraction rate, had to be so specific, so on target, he says, with a margin of error so small that he says it would be the equivalent of taking aim at a target the other end of the universe 20 billion light years away, aiming at a 1 square inch object 20 billion light years away and hitting it spot on. And then this quantum physicist said, fellas, there's no free lunch. Somebody has to pay. And that payment made by God. All of the grand schemes, all that God has done in his creation splendor, we look at all the beauty around in us and we've gone numb to it. We've still got humanists who think that television is going to solve it all. See, if Jesus had given into it, he would have given into the philosophy of utilitarianism, using and controlling the higher by the lower. Using and controlling the higher by the lower. If there's any philosophers here, I'm not going to go into the classic utilitarian philosophy of Bentham, who, as many of you know, in the 19th century got his pleasure calculus going. By the way, something most people don't know about Bentham. He's the one who popularized the idea maximum happiness for maximum number of people and formulated University College in London. Do you know what Bentham did before he died? He wanted to make sure that he was at every board meeting. So he told the board of directors that even after he died, he wanted himself put in his skeletal splendor into the wall of the boardroom. And at every board meeting, this cabinet is open, and there he is in his skeletal splendor, keeping a vacant eye upon the proceedings of the board meeting. But that's not the utilitarianism I'm talking about. That's too heavy. Here's what I'm talking about. How we try to use God in our terms. Please let me say this carefully, and I want you to follow me. I sense in my heart that if there were any weightier temptation of the three, this was the weightiest of them all. Let me tell you why. Because 2 instances later, Jesus was faced with the same option when Peter tried to dislodge him from the cross. And it was immediately after Peter had affirmed his deity, to which Jesus had said, flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And then immediately after that, the Bible says, then Jesus began to tell him of the manner of death that he should die. And Peter said, not so, Lord. And Jesus immediately rebuked him and said, get thee behind me, Satan. Then on the cross, They're asking him to save himself and the others. Again, I believe in some form that temptation is coming, but possibly in the most painful way. And I say this reverently and limitedly, trusting that the Lord will somehow smoothen over the bumpy spots of this thought here. But when I think of Jesus in that garden saying something of this nature, Father, if there be any other way, is there some other way that you can accomplish what you are trying to accomplish? There is utilitarian as the temptation comes head on. Jesus portrays it to you and us, but thankfully that was only the first half of the sentence. But nevertheless, not my will but thine be done. He felt the weight, and here's why I say it. And I remember a student at the University of Caltech raising this. I'll try to expand upon it. I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that people who reject Christianity because it is the only way, if God had given 1,000,000 ways, they would have asked for 1,000,000 plus one. Chesterton says, I'm not going to complain to God that he made only one way, no more than I'm going to complain to him that he only allowed me to marry one woman. He said, I'm going to thank God for giving me the privilege of marrying one, and I'm going to thank God for the privilege that there is a gate, there is a door through which I can walk in. And as Jesus looks at this head on, if there is any other way, nevertheless not my will, but thine be done. Jesus was talking of the centerpiece of the gospel, the cross, as God himself, as it were, turned his back upon him, and he cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I believe Jesus uttered those words so that you and I would never have to utter them. Point one was an appeal to the intellect. Had Jesus yielded, it had been materialism. He appeals to the will. Had Jesus yielded, it had been utilitarianism. Let me move to the third one. Satan now moves away from the intellect, moves away now from the will, and he has only one approach left. That's the imagination. And he says, I give you all the kingdoms of this world if you'll bow down and worship me. This is the focal point to which I want to draw our attention. I want you to listen as I tie this thought together. I haven't read much of it anywhere, but I think it is marvelously woven, possibly mostly in the writings of Muggeridge. You know, two of the most powerful forces in the world today are music and television. They are powerful and they are good in many ways, but they are also very risky. I'll tell you why. Because music and the visual has the capacity to bypass reason and go straight for the imagination. See, when you listen to something by word, your imagination remains sovereign on it. But when a picture is given to you, that imagination becomes sovereign over you. And television is now conquering the last bastion. They want our young people not just listening to music anymore. They want to rivet the pictures that are associated with the music upon the imaginations of our young people. It is the last threshold to be crossed, and television is crossing it with devastating consequences. As the imagination has been invaded, we are living at the tail end of the 20th century, raising a generation of young people all over this globe where the imagination no longer has the capacity to harness it because the intellect no longer can keep up with the barrage of pictures invading it. How do I say that? William Blake said it years ago about the eyes. He said this life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and goads you to believe a lie when you see with and not through the eye. We are meant to see through the eye with the conscience. Modern communication is getting us to see with the eye, devoid of a conscience. Isn't it interesting that which Turner considers the greatest asset of our time, centuries ago, God said would be one of the greatest curses. When the Tower of Babel was being built, God said, let's pluralize their languages, because if not, they will be homogenized and unified in their sin against me, and the confusion of languages came upon us. For the first time in the history of mankind, the whole world is speaking the same language, and it's not propositional, it's visual. Muggeridge said to me, and I said, what is the greatest contribution you've made in your writing? He said, my book, Christ in the Media. And in that book, Christ and the Media, he says this. Let me quote some words by Simone Weil, in my opinion, one of the most luminous intelligences of our time. Words which I have often meditated upon, which are very relevant to my subject. In reality, nothing is so beautiful, nothing so continually fresh and surprising, so full of sweet and perpetual ecstasy as the good. No desert is so dreary, monotonous, and boring as evil. But with fantasy, it's the other way around. Fictional good is boring and flat, while fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. Do you see what she's saying there? In reality, nothing is so beautiful as the good. Nothing so full of perpetual ecstasy as the good. No desert so monotonous and boring as evil. That's in reality. But in our imagination, it's the other way around. Fictional evil is varied, intriguing, attractive, and full of charm. And you've got good that becomes monotonous and boring and dull. Don't believe it? Tomorrow night, show the Sermon on the Mount on television. Watch the Nielsen ratings. Next night, show David and Bathsheba and watch the Nielsen ratings. The capacity to think evil that moves us to a point of unbridled imagination. Ladies and gentlemen, if Jesus had yielded to this temptation, he would have yielded to hedonism. The intellect would have brought about materialism. The will would have brought about utilitarianism. The imagination would have brought about hedonism. And Jesus says, "Begone, Satan. It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him alone shall you serve." He puts two words together. Worship from the Greek word proskunine, from which we transliterate prostrate, and latreia, from which we get service. The mind and the hands, all totally submitted to God. That's what man must do. Not worship himself or the temptations that surround him. As I weave the thread in closing, I find it so important to come to grips with these ideas. The imagination stirred, challenged in our time, leading us to pleasure. Let me give you a simple illustration, 2 quotes, and I'll be through. You know, we have 3 children. My next book is being dedicated to them, to my wife who has lovingly helped, and my children who have lovingly hindered. But I'm with Chesterton. I've learned more from watching my children than I have ever from a manual in philosophy. They're growing up now. Move back years ago, say when they were 2, 5, and 8 maybe. Let me give you a classic illustration that will help you to understand what I'm saying here. You see, if I were telling them the same fairy tale, please notice the different reactions. If I took Sarah at age 8 and I said to her, "Sarah, little Tommy got up and walked up to the door and opened the door, and a dragon jumped in front of Tommy," Sarah's eyes go wide. Little Naomi, who when she was born, her cheeks were so fat that it made her eyes look like an afterthought. Her hair was born at a 45-degree angle, took weeks to settle down. Short, pudgy little arms, you know. Imagine me telling her the same story. "Nimmy, little Tommy got up, walked up to the door and opened the door." Naomi's eyes go wide. Nate, whose whole worldview is exhausted in one word, cookie, at age 2. I say, "Nathan, little Tommy got up and walked up to the door." His eyes get wide. Do you see the difference? Sarah needed the dragon. Naomi needed to open the door. For Nathan, it was a pretty big deal at age 2 to walk up to the door. The older you get, the more it takes to fill your heart with wonder, and only God is big enough to fill it. Materialism, utilitarianism, hedonism. Mix them in a hodgepodge of varieties and you've got the footnotes for the rest of the philosophies of the world today. I take 2 thoughts and sign off. And thank you so much for the patience with which you have listened and for the privilege of those who have given me the opportunity to share with you. I take Blaise Pascal, the French mystic, and Muggeridge and draw it to a close. Please give me your undivided attention. Two magnificent thoughts. I'll need to concentrate immensely. Pascal, who died at such an early age, and when they opened his jacket, found sewn in his jacket was his conversion testimony. The greatest philosophical scientist since Archimedes, the father of the modern computer, inventor of the barometer, who was instrumentally led to Christ primarily through the testimony of his sister. Pascal said this: "It is in vain, O men, that you seek within yourselves the cure for all your miseries. All your insight has led you to the knowledge that it is not in yourselves that you will discover the true and the good. The philosophers promised them to you, but they were not able to keep that promise because they do not know what your good is or what your true nature is. How then could they have provided for you a cure for the ills they have not even understood? Your principal maladies are pride, which has separated you from God, and sensuality, which binds you to the earth, and they have done nothing but foster at least one of them. If they have offered God to you for an object, it is to pander your pride. They have made you think that you are like him and resemble him in your nature. Those who have grasped the vanity of such pretensions have cast you down into the other end of the abyss and have led you to seek your good in lust, which is the lot of animals. It is in vain that you seek for a cure." Take Muggeridge as you flip the coin over in a masterful quote that ought to be penned someday, some wall in heaven, because I think God inspired him in some way to come out with such a magnificent series of ideas. And he said this: "We look back upon history and what do we see? Empires rising and falling, revolutions and counter-revolutions, wealth accumulated and wealth dispersed. Shakespeare has spoken of the rise and fall of great ones that ebb and flow with the moon." He says, "I look back upon my own fellow countrymen, once upon a time dominating a quarter of the world, most of them convinced in the words of what is still a popular song, that the God who made the mighty shall make them mightier yet. I've heard a crazed crack Austrian announce to the world the establishment of a Reich that would last 1,000 years. I've seen an Italian clown saying he was going to stop and restart the calendar with his own ascension to power. I've met a murderous Georgian brigand in the Kremlin, acclaimed by the intellectual elite of the world as a wiser than Solomon, more humane than Marcus Aurelius, more enlightened than Ashoka. I have seen America wealthier and in terms of military weaponry more powerful than the rest of the world put together, so that had the American people so desired, they could have outdone a Caesar or an Alexander in the range and scale of their conquest. All in one lifetime, gone with the wind. England, part of a tiny island off the coast of Europe, threatened with dismemberment and even bankruptcy. Hitler and Mussolini dead, remembered only in infamy. Stalin, a forbidden name in the regime he helped found and dominate for some 3 decades. America haunted by fears of running out of those precious fluids that keep some motorways roaring and the smog settling. With troubled memories and painful memories of a disastrous campaign in Vietnam and the victory of the Don Quixotes of the media as they charged the windmills of Watergate. All in one lifetime, gone with the wind. Behind the debris of these solemn supermen and self-styled imperial diplomatists stands the gigantic figure of one person, because of whom, by whom, in whom, and through whom alone mankind may still have hope, the person of Jesus Christ. The more I look at the saviors of men, the more beautiful the Lamb of God looks to me.